So the conversation you're about to hear is a chat with a man called Kurt Krichler, who's been on the LGBTIQ activism scene for many, many years. He started in 1979, as you'll hear him say himself. Kurt was one of the OG ILGA people. He was on their board of governors. Even though he stayed in his home city of Vienna, he did his European level activism from there. The reason why I spoke to Kurt is because he helped set up an organization called Athena Forum, which is the only organization that's challenging now his former organization. Athena Forum are challenging ILGA and all of the other LGBTIQ NGOs in Europe, challenging their advocacy supremacy, I suppose you could say. They're directing their energy towards the institutions, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, and also recently the UN, to try and sort of beat back at a little bit of the excesses of the LGBTIQ movement. Specifically, coming up next week, today is the 21st of January 2026. Next week, there will be a vote on a resolution in the Council of Europe, which will be about passing a conversion therapy ban recommendation to states, essentially. So those are very, very bad idea, these conversion therapy bans, which for reasons we'll get into in the conversation. We talk a little bit about Kurt's past activism and how it feeds into his present activism, and just a bit of an overview of the situation in Europe in general. And I hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you do, it would really help me if you could go to peakedsubstack.com and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you really feel generous, you can take out a paid subscription, which would help me to do more of this kind of work and bring you more kind of interviews like that interview with Kurt. Thank you. Welcome to the Peaked podcast, where I talk about gender identity ideology and other bad ideas, women's rights and free speech from a European point of view. So, good morning, Kurt Krichler.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm fine. It's a little cold here in Vienna, but I'm doing
How
well.
cold are we talking? I'm at 2 degrees here in Brussels. What are you?
Minus during the night.
What? Oh my God. Okay, right now that's real winter. Okay, you win. I actually just double checked as we're talking here. It's actually 6 in Brussels. So
Wow.
yeah.
Spring is coming.
Yeah, and if you're Irish like me, spring is actually next week. We count spring as the 1st of February. The spring months are February, March, April, and summer starts on the 1st of May, which continental Europeans find that very weird because for you, spring doesn't start for like another month and a half. So I announced that I was going to talk to you on Twitter, and I made 2 fatal mistakes in my tweet. The first one was that I said that you used to be an ILGA staffer, and that's not correct at all.
No, I was a volunteer basically all the time and also a board member, but it was the paid job.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You were a board member, which is a completely different thing. And also the other mistake I made was that I spelled your name wrong. I spelled it with a H. Of course, somebody comes and knocks on my door as soon as I start recording. I'm just going to ignore the postman and hope he goes away. I spelled your name wrong. I called you Kurt Krichler, and the Krickler with a H, which would have completely transformed your name from Kurt Krichler to Kurt Krichler.
Yeah.
In German. So a Germanophone jumped straight into the comments and was like, it's not spelled that way. So I apologize to all my Germanophone.
There were worse things, really.
There were worse things. Yeah, it could have been worse.
The last of our concerns.
Yeah, we have some issues on our plate. So you are talking to me today because we do have quite a big issue on our plate in Europe, which everybody knows. The big picture is that we're captured by gender ideology, every country to a different extent. Before we get into it, how bad are things in Austria? How captured is Austria on a scale of 1 to 10, would you say?
Maybe 7, I don't know. Because with the new government we have and the conservatives now being more cautious, I think we managed, for example, in the last couple of years, or actually last summer in July, to derail the project of conversion therapy ban here in Austria because gender identity was included. So the conservatives finally thought it was not a good idea. So we had some successes here, yeah. So
how easy is that to undo? Because I see in the Netherlands, the TERFs managed to get self-ID taken off the table. But now that if the left comes back into power, they're just talking about reintroducing it. Like, how unsteady is this victory, or how stable is this victory?
Well, in Austria, it's quite stable because at the next elections, we definitely will have a very right-wing government with the Freedom Party probably having the chancellery plus the conservative, the junior partner. So we don't have to worry here, really. Even if that government would introduce something, we just wait for the next government. I mean, it's really very sad and to say that, but yeah, left parties like the Greens, the Socialists, and the Liberals, they of course would pass those legislation immediately if they would be in power. So it's really trist and sad that you have to hope that they will not return into power and they wouldn't have a majority in parliament. So yeah, for Austria, it's quite relaxed in this respect because
Okay, the
freedom
day
house is really up in the polls up to almost 40%. Can you imagine?
Wow. I mean, all over Europe, it
Yeah.
seems to be the biggest parties, the most popular parties are the anti-immigration right-wing parties, and who also happen to have the same goals in mind with regard to our topic. So, I mean, the lefties did it to themselves. I'm sorry, I can't feel much sympathy for them. Okay, let's start by just talking a little bit about who you are. I know who you are. Could you tell our listeners who you are and a little bit about your background, please, Kurt?
Yeah, well, I'm quite old now, 66, and I have been involved in the gay movement for almost 45 years now, starting in Austria with funding Homosexuelle Initiative Róisín, the first association here in the country in 79. And I worked for the organization 40 years, basically 39 years in different capacities as a board member, as an editor of the magazine for almost 40 years. And I was involved also on the international level from very early on, like 81 was my first ILGA conference. It was ILGA at that time, the International Gay Association. And then got involved in their lobbying projects, which was a completely different thing like today. I mean, we had no money, we had no paid staff. It was all from our private resources or sometimes from the member organizations' resources. And I was working on Council of Europe issues on OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, plus United Nations issues. And then in 96, when ILGA started to regionalize and the first regional association or group of ILGA-Europe was founded, I was part of it, was in the founding board and actually was then also appointed co-secretary general, which I stayed for 7 years until 2003.
What year was that, sorry, that you were elected to the board, Kurt?
Yeah, in 96, and I was elected in the board of ILGA-Europe. There were 8 people, I think, and out of these 8 people, I was appointed as a co-chair, and I stayed in this capacity till 2003, when I left the board after 7 years, because I thought it's already too long and it was really very, very a lot of work.
Things were changing at that point as well.
And I kept going to ILGA-Europe conferences as a representative of Róisín up until 2017. And until that, I could really support what ILGA-Europe was doing and identify with it. But I think in the last 10 years or so, or 8 years, they really changed direction. And I feel a little bit sorry that the focus has turned to gender identity away from sex and all the implications we all know. So yeah, that's my background basically.
Right, and I just want to explain what ILGA-Europe to those who may not know what it is. We assume everyone knows, but some people don't. So when you first joined, it was called the International Gay Association, IGA, IGA, I guess, or European Gay Association.
No, it was the International Gay Association, and then the L came to the name later, and the acronym.
What year?
That was in 86 in Copenhagen.
86, we got the lesbians, and then...
And later, I don't know when it happened, but the acronym stayed ILGA, but I think it's now for intersex and trans.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, because I've been writing about intersex campaigning advocacy recently, and I saw the intersex got really quietly added in 2008. That was also very interesting. Right, so they kept adding things to it, but we kept sort of calling it ILGA. And so it went from ILGA then to ILGA-Europe and ILGA-World. And my understanding of that is because when you got money from the European Commission, you can't be advocating for the world, you have to advocate for Europe. So is that more or less the correct interpretation?
Right. Why? The main reason for regionalization was that to make the organization more efficient, because ILGA World, as the World Organization, had little resources, that's true, but also it was very Eurocentric at that time. So the idea behind was that you have also strong regional associations in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia. So, and they could develop that.
Right, so you needed to develop their own thing, I guess, and not be sapping all the funds from the Brussels office. And you never ended up coming to join the Borg in Brussels. You stayed in Vienna this whole time.
Yeah. That was, I mean, until 2000, we didn't even have an office in Brussels.
Yeah, there's a very interesting article written by some guy who came, I think he might have an Asian name, he might be British. It's out there somewhere. He wrote his PhD about setting up ILGA in Brussels, or that was maybe incidental in his PhD, but I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes and I'll send it to you as well. It was quite interesting. It was about the history of ILGA and how things changed when homosexuality or sexual orientation got added to the Amsterdam Treaty, if I'm not making things up. That was 98 or 99, something like that?
Yeah, 98, and I think the adoption of the treaty, and I don't remember when it came into force. I think it was maybe a little later, but I can't tell. I couldn't tell out of my brain. I would have to research that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long history.
One of our main projects at that time, and it was a big victory. And of course, it actually paved the way, because that was, so to say, the reason why the European Commission could finally introduce anti-discrimination legislation, including sexual orientation, and also provide funding for the organizations that would work on anti-discrimination, including ILGA-Europe.
So that's an important element of how the EU works, is that as long as it's in the treaty, then we can make rules about it and we can give money towards it. So once sexual orientation got into the EU treaty, then it was okay to make anti-discrimination laws. Otherwise, they can't do it, which is, I'm always going off on a tangent, but which is how we've gotten to this point recently, where the EU wasn't able to add hate speech to the EU treaty or hate crimes to the EU treaty, and in order to make hate crime laws, directives, binding laws. So what they've done instead is they've looked at what was already in the treaty, and there's cybercrime. So now cybercrime is being retrofitted to include hate speech, and that's how we're going to get binding laws on it. So this is, I don't know if you've been following ILGA discussions recently, but this has been the workaround for not being able to get hate speech against LGBTIQA+, etc. into EU laws. Anyway, that's as an aside.
That example, I didn't follow that too closely, but I remember that the same was when they wanted to introduce more labels like female, male, or man, woman, and then they did it through the data protection legislation.
Ah, yes.
That was the same through the backdoor, kind of, and which was actually not the intent to say people can refer to the Data Protection Act or legislation to ask for a third option whenever they use a website, and with a click down menu, if you book a ticket on the train or...
Yeah, so the case was, so they're just very clever lawyers. They said, we have this data protection law that says that you don't gather data on people that you don't need. So the case that was brought to the European Court to the Court of Justice was, the French railway line doesn't need to know if I'm male or female in order to sell me a train ticket. So why are they asking me that when I go to buy a ticket online? And then in the judgment, of course, we introduced the concept of discrimination against non-binary people, because this excludes them. And then that's how the little tiny snowball turns into an avalanche eventually. So you're very familiar with this sort of, that's the EU, and you're quite familiar with that, but you're also familiar with the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is something else, and I don't want to spend, because I think the last time I spoke to Faika, we spent a long time talking about this. And by the way, you're with Athena Forum, which we didn't mention. Athena Forum is like a new NGO, a new organization. Would you like to give a little spiel about what Athena is before we launch into it?
Well, it's, as you said, a new organization that wants to go back to sex-based, evidence-based policies and policy and lobbying, and would concentrate on the biological sex and sexual orientation when it comes to lobbying, and go away from gender identity, ideology, and similar ideas. And it's an organization registered in Austria under Austrian law, but our focus is European-wide.
And who are you targeting? Which institutions or which entities are you
basically
going
the
after?
European Union and also the Council of Europe now, but also we have also given statements into the United Nations recently for a report prepared by the independent expert on Sochi issues. So we are just at the start of our work. We were founded in August last year officially and launched the organization in October. So, yeah. But I'm very proud of all the things we already have done and producing a lot of policy papers, also for the European Commission's LGBTIQ plus strategy for 2026 to 2030, where again you have a lot of these very problematic ideas and proposals for the member states, which is now like ban on conversion measures or self-ID comes now also in the Council of Europe resolution we probably will talk about later.
Yep. So you are very well placed, very well experienced to do this kind of work. It's really necessary to have someone who understands how.
Yeah, although I was away from the whole circuit for almost 10 years or longer, and I have to get into the topic again a little because I missed a few of the details and of the developments recently. Yeah, but in general, yeah.
We need to backtrack and talk about the Council of Europe, what it is and what they're going to do next week. But does it strike you that it has changed a lot since you were lobbying these institutions? Like how many years ago? What, 30 years ago now?
25 years ago. Well, I think the tools are the same. You talk to members of the Parliamentary Assembly in that case, which are the representatives from the national parliaments from 46 member states of the Council of Europe, and they are represented in Strasbourg at the Council of Europe according to their strength in the national parliaments. So I would imagine that the conservatives and right-wing parties would actually have a majority in the Parliamentary Assembly at the moment due to the results of the national elections all over Europe. They have actually now, I see, also a committee on equality and non-discrimination. So that's a new thing. I think that they actually...
Yeah, I think they set that up like not so long ago. It feels really new.
So there is easy access, but you would just find one sympathetic member of the assembly, and basically you would choose somebody you know from your home country who is a representative there and the record of that person, and then you would work with that person to persuade her or him to table a motion, to draft a resolution, and you would help them drafting this. And I mean, if you read through that draft text of the resolution here, it's obvious that it was written by gay, lesbian, and transgender activists. It was definitely not done by Kate Osborne or a close staff member of her.
I'm going to open it up in front of me as well. Can I, while I'm looking for it there, can you, Kurt, tell us what is the Council of Europe and what are they doing next week?
Yeah. Well, the Council of Europe, as I mentioned, is a European-wide international organization with 46 member states. So it goes beyond the 27 member states of the European Union. They are all members also in the Council of Europe. But on top of that, there are other European members. They, like on the Balkans or even in the Caucasus region, so Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia would be part of it too. And Russia was actually part, but was expelled after the war on Ukraine. Turkey is a member. So it's much broad, except for Belarus and Russia, it basically comprises the whole continent. And the Parliamentary Assembly is not like a European Parliament. They can't actually vote on binding legislation for the member states. They would tackle certain issues they think are important, and then they would draft resolutions, and then they would pass resolutions to the member states and try to persuade them this way to do certain things. Yeah,
right.
But and so like the European Parliament of the European Union, it can't make legislation.
Right. And so that's one of the things that we hear a lot. Like I've been sort of researching the Council of Europe for quite a long time, as well as the European Commission, the European Parliament. And one of the objections you hear when you try to raise the alarm that something's going on at the Council of Europe, which is what Athena Forum is trying to do right now with this resolution coming up next week, people say, yeah, but it's not binding. Or they say, is this binding? Like, when should I expect to see this in our legislative bodies, like adopt this? And you say, well, no, it's not. So Kurt, can you explain why it matters if it's not legally binding? Because I just hear this all the time and I have my own answer and I'm interested in
Well, the thing is that it will be used by the movement, and I may know that too, because we had used a lot of those resolutions, both from the European Parliament, who also votes on resolutions that are not binding, but also from the Council of Europe. You basically use it on your national lobbying. And when we had discriminatory legislation in the penal code even, and there were these resolutions where Austria and all the other member states of the Council of Europe were kind of called upon to strike those laws or other things, it made a difference. The movement at the national level can always refer to it and can mention it. And of course, it has an impact in the mindset of politicians and it trickles down. And also politicians who are supportive can use it in the parliament against the opponents and say, but listen, see, the Council of Europe wants us to do that. And this is something we should follow. So it makes a pressure upon politicians at the national level to follow those resolutions.
But am I correct in interpreting then from your answer that it's the degree to which people hold the institution itself in esteem is the degree to which people think that its resolutions or its non-binding instructions are worth listening to? Because we see now that, especially on the right, people are just sort of shitting all over the Council of Europe and saying, why are we in this institution? We have to leave. This is in the UK I'm talking about. And so you have countries that will just say, we're not doing that. Like a lot of countries in those 46 member states, they'll just, am I right, ignore these kind of instructions that go against their quote unquote traditional values or whatever. And it's countries like mine, Ireland, who are just really, really eager to please, who will follow along and who hold the institution itself in great esteem. And the politicians don't want to upset anyone in Strasbourg. It's sort of only held together by force of its reputation as a worthwhile institution. I personally think the Council of Europe is ruining its own reputation by putting out this nonsense. Like they put out a resolution or a recommendation a few weeks ago on intersex, which basically says, and nobody's picked up on this yet, and I'm hoping one day maybe Athena Forum will look into it, but they said they're recommending to all the countries to allow people to have gender changes, medicalized gender changes at a young age, regardless of whether they identify as intersex or not. There's no such thing as intersex, but this is the kind of thing that will destroy its own reputation in the eyes of regular people. And then I guess the response to that is, well, that's why regular people don't ever find out about these things. What do you think?
No, you're completely right. Yeah. But about this intersex resolution, please alert us. I think we have overlooked that. I'm not aware of that.
I'm halfway through writing a very long article about it. I can tell you more at the end if we still have time, but the intersex resolution it's like the conversion therapy thing that's happening next week. It's all, in my mind, intended to sort of keep adding layer upon layer of queer stuff until you've got this like paperwork mountain of, oh, look, this is a real thing. Look at how real and solid this concept is. It's in all these resolutions now. It must be real. So what you're saying is why these things matter is that advocates and activists will use them. What do you mean by use them exactly? Can you give me a very concrete example of what one would do with a recommendation and a resolution like that?
We would always quote it when we go to politicians. I remember that from my Austrian lobbying work for changes, for law change and reform of the penal code, also for registered partnership. So for all the lobbying we did, we always quoted the long list of court cases, the jurisprudence, both in Strasbourg and Luxembourg, and we would quote all the resolutions, both from the European Parliament and from the Council of Europe, even if they were only non-binding resolutions, and it makes an impression on politicians. And I mean, most of those politicians, they have no clue what's going on. They're not interested. They are overloaded with so many things. So they are happy to get a little paper and where all these things are listed. And then they would, depending on how sympathetic they are to the issues from the very start, they would support it. And then, so it is important for the purpose of lobbying and advocating. But of course, there is the other group that could not care less and would simply ignore it. But yeah, I think it's going too far too. And the Council of Europe and other institutions are actually undermining their reputation when they come up with those very problematic things. And I'm actually at the point when also regarding the jurisprudence of the court in Strasbourg and the court in Luxembourg, again, for your listeners, and so the European Union has the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, and the Council of Europe is responsible for overseeing the European Convention on Human Rights and has got the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And they deliver judgments are very doubtful, and combined with these resolutions and also with the conservatives supporting it, I have the impression it's actually, I mean, it sounds like a strange conspiracy theory, but as if it's a plan to put off people and to really push them to vote for the right wing.
You're saying that conservatives are supporting this kind of extremes in our laws as a way to push people more rightwards?
Yeah, because, I mean, what would the other intention be? I think it's...
Well, it's like you say, they don't know and they're too busy. Like, do you remember, did Faika say to you, tweeted about this last week, that she wrote to one of the members of the Parliamentary Assembly, and he responded by saying, I've never even heard it, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she was talking about the actual vote. Do you know what I'm talking about?
But what vote do you mean?
Faika reached out to one of the members, and then he wrote back to her, I think it was, and he said, I wasn't even aware there was a resolution, or that I can't remember, I should look it up, if he was present or wasn't present, or if he knew it was even coming up. Or, I mean, a lot of people won't show up for this vote because they don't care, and it sounded like this guy didn't know and didn't care. And so, I mean, yeah, there aren't very many options about why the Conservatives are going along with this. I'll introduce my theory. So that there's the one is that they don't know. The other one is what you're proposing here, potentially, that they are like, right, it's kind of a type of accelerationism. I don't know if you have that word in German. Yeah. Acceleration is like, make the situation so bad. And then my theory also sometimes is that I feel like the way you said, this might be completely off base, but I'll just say it anyway. You know, the way you said, the parties in the countries themselves will send the person who's sort of best versed on that topic in their own country. They'll send them to Strasbourg. So like Kate Osborne, what did she do, a gender job before or something? I don't know. But yeah, so you'll have somebody who's responsible for that in the member states. So let's say Ireland will send people who have been dealing with the dossier on gender or LGBTIQ or whatever, who know a little bit about, or no, that's not actually correct, because the entire delegation deals with all the topics. So I need to stop myself there. That doesn't make any sense.
I think the member states probably will, or the national parliaments would have their own system of how they would send the delegates to the Parliamentary Assembly in Strasbourg of the Council of Europe, because it works different with the European Parliament. But I guess it's also on a volunteer basis. Many people would volunteer for that, those who are maybe internationally minded, or who thinks this is an extra feature in their work to travel.
Yeah.
So I don't know how it works, and maybe it's different from country to country. But so I would not say it's in the first place those people are sent to this. But when you are ILGA-Europe, you would pick a person whose record is known to you as being very LGBTQ plus friendly and supporting the gender identity ideology. You would
among your delegates,
300. So there are plenty of people to pick from.
For example, how many UK delegates would there be? How many were there in your time?
I don't know, maybe 18 or so. I don't know.
Okay, so among them there'll be some swivel-eyed gender lunatic, I presume, at least one.
Instead, from the composition of the Parliamentary Assembly, it should have actually a right-wing conservative majority, because most of the European countries are now governed by right-wing governments, plus having a right-wing majority in the national parliaments. So, but the conservatives are the weak allies here, because they often, don't care, or don't see the problem. It's very difficult.
Somebody
Where you're supposed to also modern, progressive, even as a conservative, like in Spain, just not to be considered too conservative and right-wing.
Yeah, which doesn't match their own electorate's feelings on the topic, but it does appeal, they think, to younger people who they need to feed into they need those young voters for the future. Well, what I was going to say, which doesn't really maybe make sense, but there was a period in Europe where there was like huge climate change hysteria. That's not to say that climate change isn't real, but there was a lot of money going around for climate change, and there was a lot of panic about it. So we got a lot of these green parties or more left parties, and then we had this weird period in EU history where we had a lot of like smaller coalition parties were either extremely left or they were green parties, and they tended to get the gender stuff because they were. And like the conservatives would be like, yeah, help us make up the government and you can have this gender crap. When these sort of coalitions.
Also, the national, that's perfectly the situation in Austria when we had the green conservative government for 5 years. So the conservatives would just agree to some weird things as a compromise and then something else in return from the Greens. So this is bargaining basically.
And the Greens were like, oh, we're going to change like human sexual dimorphism. We're going to flush it down the toilet. And the conservatives were like, yeah, you have your little gender thing. Who cares? And it's like, no, actually, it matters a lot. And I feel like that's sort of still happening. There was a recent vote in the council, in the European Council, not the Council of Europe, but in the EU part, so confusing. But there was a recent vote and it was all the gender people or the equality people or whatever they're calling it now, whatever the conservatives have switched to calling it now that they have the majority. What used to be the LGBTQ equalities ministers, whatever, gender ministers, all those ministers were voting on something in the LGBTIQ strategy, actually. And they all just went for it. They all just went in for it. And I know somebody who was in the room and she was just like, what the hell is going on here? Like, so you just have to wonder, what is the political wheeling and dealing going on in the background that we're not aware of? Or are they just not aware of anything at all? And is that why it's so important that you people are here now, Athena Forum, to just write to them and say, I'm sorry, but you can't just say, I didn't know there was a conversion therapy vote next week and I don't know anything about it. Like, it has huge implications. Can you tell us about the conversion therapy resolution and the vote and what's in it and why it needs to be blocked, please, Kurt?
Well, it really is very, very broad and very, very deep. And it's amazing. I can't see any other topic where the Council of Europe would propose such a detailed list of recommendations of things to do for the member states. I mean, including that to have even complaint procedures for the victims and witnesses of conversion practices, to even close all loopholes, as they clearly say. So, and even when people are referred to conversion therapy abroad, that should be made illegal. You know, the details are incredible. Formalize, I just quote from here, or strengthen cooperation with relevant professional organizations in such areas as psychology, psychiatry, social work, including to discuss legislation criminalizing conversion practices. So this is really, I mean, down into a detail where obviously some gay activists or LGBTIQ activists got carried away. And it's really the full wish list. I couldn't imagine any other.
That has so many provisions in it, like you must go after.
I couldn't imagine that countries like Montenegro or Georgia would take it and next day would sit down and implement that.
I mean, those countries have they're in a particular difficult situation with these kind of resolutions. So, but I'll get on to that in a minute because they're accession states to the EU, but they're under a certain type of pressure. And I mean, Montenegro, I think it's Montenegro, introduced civil partnerships against the will of the majority of the people, it would seem. The first marriages had to take place under armed guard. And now there are like these little businesses popping up. There's apparently in Montenegro, I hope I'm getting the country right. I think in Montenegro, there's along the coast, there's like these beach resort places where have now become these like come and get married and fly home the next day for Montenegrins who are gay to come back to come back home, get married in their home country, and then leave immediately. So these services popping up in this like beach resort town, because you can't live as a gay couple in maybe in the capital or whatever. But so they are introducing these provisions as demanded by the EU for accession.
Which is not true. I mean, they could not force any accession country to introduce registered partnership in order to...
Right, isn't it it's the pressure of it, though. I mean, it's another...
It's definitely not in the Copenhagen criteria, which are the...
Right.
But of course, if you apply the jurisprudence of the Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice, you may argue that, because in a Polish
I think
case,
that is being argued, because
there are still 5 countries in the European Union who don't have any sort of registered partnership or any legal way for same-sex couples to get registered.
Right, but they're in already.
Poland lost the case. I mean, there is the court from the European Court of Human Rights. They ordered Poland in the judgment to provide some sort of... And I think that this is fine. I don't challenge this, because nowadays it's mainstream, and the Strasbourg Court would always, in those delicate issues, wait for a majority of countries to have followed those. So it would not go in front of their development. And so obviously is there more than half of the 46 member states of the Council of Europe have already some sort of registered partnership or even marriage equality. The court did not ask for marriage equality, actually, but some sort.
Just recognition of couples, So they don't have to introduce it themselves. They just have to accept that some people will have these marriage certificates and they have to be recognized for administrative purposes. Is that right?
No, that was the court in Luxembourg from the European Union. But that is also only a right once you're using your right of movement within the European Union.
Right, for mobile citizens,
Yeah, you can't just go, for example, to 2 girls from Slovakia can't just come over to Vienna, marry here, and after 2 days go back and say...
That makes sense then why there's these like services where you have to be a citizen and living in somewhere else and then have use your mobile citizen rights in order to avail of this.
You must live there. I mean, that's again, it will be probably maybe more litigation needed to find out what this actually means, that you have established a family relation, a family thing in that country of choice when you return to your home country. That's not clear yet. But the court in Strasbourg, the Court of Human Rights, has actually delivered a judgment forcing Poland to anyway introduce legislation to acknowledge same-sex couples. So they may argue, okay, this is part of human rights and any accession countries must adhere to it, although it's not really part of the Copenhagen criteria.
And actually, I know that people have been trying to find out, including me, whether or not the jurisprudence is going to be taken into account when the evaluations are done about the accession states' progress. And when we say accession states, I think we're talking shop here, and maybe people might be confused, but accession states are the countries that want to join the EU, and so they get evaluated like once a year at least, maybe a couple of times a year, and on all of the criteria. Like the Commission is particularly concerned about rule of law stuff and corruption in the courts and independent judiciary and stuff like that before they'll allow Albania, Montenegro, whatever.
Albania is on the list quite far.
Yeah, they have all these criteria. And there's a bunch of jurisprudence about LGBTIQ stuff. And I know that ILGA are working very, very hard to sort of shoehorn those judgments into the concept of rule of law. Whereas my understanding of rule of law has always been about independent judiciary and lack of corruption or whatever at that level of government. And I think what ILGA is trying to do now is trying to say, but upholding these court judgments is part of rule of law. So I think that's kind of extravagant.
That argumentation may work for the jurisprudence for the Council for the European Court of the European Union.
That was the first part of the conversation. If you would like to hear the rest, you can go to peaked.substack.com to hear more. You do that by taking out a paid subscription, which helps me to continue this work and to quit my day job so I can do more of it. Thank you very much. peaked.substack.com.